we can get started. Thank you guys for being here. The name of this presentation is called Who Are Our Friends, Who Are Our Enemies, and Who Are the Grifters? So first I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dubian. Dubian is a writer, organizer, anarchist, and library worker currently based in Washington, D.C. They have been engaged in activism and community organizing for over 12 years and was one of the founding members of BLM Ithaca, New York, as well as the BLM Upstate New York Coalition. Today they work at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library's People's Archive, where they lead Black Studies Book Club, a program that engages the DC area residents in the Black radical tradition. And we have Lauren. Lauren has been with Dare to Struggle Chicago since early 2025, following the murder of Timothy Glaze on January 3rd, 2025, at the hands of Chicago police. Lauren has contributed to organizing efforts surrounding families in Illinois whose loved ones have been murdered by law enforcement. She has also assisted in campaigns around Cook County Jail, standing with the incarcerated masses inside and families and supporters outside the jail to fight back against the hellish conditions. Lauren was arrested earlier this year while protesting the one-year anniversary of Timothy's murder. She fought her charges and her case was dismissed. And then we have Joy James in the building.
Yeah.
Joy James is an organizer.
I just hate the list of books because it sounds like we're in a library. But for me, what's been important and transformative has been working with political prisoners and being able to understand the struggles and how they have not been defeated despite the violence of the state. And so thank you for organizing all this.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So, I just want to set the tone for the panel, just to kind of acknowledge what the problem is. The problem of grifters is such an important topic overall in this conference, not only because families are taken advantage of when they are new to the struggle, but also because resistance movements have time and time again been hijacked and misled by grifters. Families who have been fighting for justice for years understand this problem and are all too familiar with this problem. Yet there's a lot of tiptoeing around speaking around this issue. It's usually for selfish reasons on the part of grifters who know that if this issue is discussed, then they will be exposed. But also it's by people who are concerned with potentially hurting honest people who are convinced by these grifters. So grifters and opportunists are not a new thing when it comes to revolutionary movements reaching out to them. In our society in the US, there is a pervasive culture of hyper-individualism where people prioritize themselves and their careers over their communities and the people. And this behavior, this grifter behavior, is used by the government, is institutionalized as a defense mechanism in order to maintain itself, maintain the status quo. Today, grifters have become a huge obstacle in the struggle for justice and will continue to be for resistance movements in the future, continue to co-opt and mislead them away from organization and politics that could pose a threat to the system. So we must have the ability to distinguish between our friends and our enemies. So who are the grifters? Grifting generally is defined as someone who moves dishonestly for self-serving purposes. More commonly, it's financially motivated, but also could be ego-driven and about clout chasing. So politically, this refers to individuals and organizations that attach themselves to movements in order for some sort of personal gain rather than as a genuine commitment to radical change. In turn, especially when these grifters vie for leadership, they in turn limit the movement politically and its capacity for resistance and organization. So, just a few things about identifying the grifters. Identifying grifters requires us to look at what materially sustains them, their practical activity, and where their politics or beliefs are leading towards. Often these individuals don't take risks that will cost them, and usually this means they stay strictly within the bounds of the official channels when they fight for justice. And I think a big thing is that they treat families as window dressing, as passive actors who they do things for, rather than as leaders themselves in their fight for justice. So just to name 4 examples of types of grifters, we have the politician who uses families and movements for votes and attention for their campaigns, and then they push people down, reformist roads. I'm sure everyone can think of an example of hearing a politician say, we need systemic change, that's why you have to elect me and put me in office. Our next example is the lawyer who is more worried about a quick payout and will advise the families to opt out of movements entirely. Usually this is for the purpose of staying within the good graces of judges and prosecutors to ensure they have a successful payout, which means they usually disregard the family's demand for sending the killer cops to jail. And then there's the nonprofits and NGOs and the individuals who work in them. Individuals in academia, this is usually what it looks like. Individuals will come from academia, and they're usually more concerned with trying to secure or maintain their high-paying position within a nonprofit. And the function of nonprofits, the way they rely on philanthropic foundations and grant funding, they inherently limit themselves both ideologically and tactically when fighting for justice. And this is just for the purpose of make sure that those funding, those donations keep coming in. And this means that people who are usually well-meaning, who do get convinced by these nonprofits, are then led into these reformist dead ends. And then you have the social media personality who do it all for money and clout, who try to insist that their popularity or followers online translate to being qualified leaders. They often jump in front of the media to speak on behalf of families, but as soon as that media is gone, they leave themselves because there's no opportunity to clout chase. And then, so the consequences of having a pervasive grifter, having this grifter behavior being so pervasive is that they're usually dishonest about what they believe and where their plans will lead. So this means that there's a lack of understanding and clarity about what they believe. And this kind of leaves people confused when they hear politicians and nonprofits use this radical language, but they end up screwing families over, movements over, leading people down dead ends, and ultimately people start to think that it's not worth even participating in movements because they seemingly lead nowhere. So people are left demoralized by the effectiveness of taking political action. And a part of this institutionalized grifter behavior is that the system conditions us to believe that these reformist schemes and grifter organizations are just the normal channels of dissent, rather than what it actually is, which is government political repression, which serves the purpose of channeling energy out of radical movements that could potentially pose a threat to the system, but what it actually does is lead people into non-threatening reformism. So the question is, what do we do about it? Where do we go from here? How do we connect with and bring forward the people that could be a base of support and that's united on a political line that can push the movement forward? And how do we get ahead of these grifters, expose them, push them out of our movements so they cannot hijack our movements and lead them to dead ends? So I'd like to turn to our speakers now. We have some questions for them. We can start with Dubian. So the question I have for you, Dubian, is how have you seen NGOs and groups like BLM hold back the struggle? Where do they lead militant struggle? And how do they get ahead in a position to steer its direction?
Hey y'all, how y'all doing? Good afternoon. Yeah, so once upon a time, in 2016, I and a group of folks from Ithaca community, I was organizing in upstate Ithaca, New York. We had just came back from the first movement for Black Lives National convening that was held in Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, and out of that, although M for BL is not the same as BLM, it's kind of still the same. But so we came back from there and we decided that we were going to set up our own Black Lives Matter chapter in Ithaca, New York. Now at the time, folks in the Ithaca community were already organizing around police brutality. We had Sean Greenwood, who was killed by police in 2012. He was shot in his vehicle while trying to drive away from the cops. So folks had already been doing grassroots organizing around that, and we just decided that because BLM was so popular, I mean, at the time, BLM was at the height of its powers. We decided that we would just like start a Black Lives Matter chapter. And we happened to start the chapter not soon after it was announced that Alicia Garza and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi were coming to Ithaca to give a speaking engagement at Cornell University. So this is the perfect time to, introduce like the chapter to the community and get, support from Alicia and Opal and get them to come down and speak to the community. And it was a struggle to get them to do that. It was a struggle to get them to come down after their speaking engagement, but we actually was able to get them to come down, and when they came down, they met with us as a chapter and told us that they would give us resources and plug us in, patch us in with the national network. And then they left, and we never heard from them again, and we never saw them again. And we called, and we, emailed, and they did not answer our calls. So we decided that we were still gonna try to do the work that folks have already been doing. We'll do it under the brand of BLM. And BLM, these folks were essentially on a speaking engagement tour, going to different universities and talking about the BLM movements and putting themselves in a position that represents the BLM movement, while local organizers and the families most affected were not receiving the money that they were getting from those engagements. And so the local chapter work came to be absorbed into this platform in which folks like Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrice Cullors could use in order to gain access to grant funding, to establish relationships with donors, to support their side hustles in consulting, and also getting these high-profile speaking engagements and appearances. People were eager to give money to BLM as a national organization, more so than even the local BLM chapters that were actually doing the work. So the grassroots chapters were carrying the work, but BLM as a national organization was really taking the credit and reaping the benefits, right? So our work continued regardless of that. We led demonstrations, campaigns to get the IPD SWAT truck removed, raise money for mutual aid, organized community discussions, and we were not receiving any support from nationals, so what we did was we reached out to other BLM chapters in the New York State area, BLM Syracuse, for instance, BLM Albany, BLM Buffalo, connected with folks in Binghamton, and we came together and formed a coalition. We called ourselves BLM Upstate New York. And through that coalition, we sort of coordinated BLM organizing completely on our own, right? Like we didn't get any, like the extent of the resources that were available on their website at the time were press kits for how to talk to the press, right? But at this time, we could really use like, you know, money for like bailing folks out of jail and like money for, you know, helping folks with medical bills that were sustained from injuries, from confronting the police and so many other things, money for the families most affected. And that was not provided by BLM. So calls for transparency for BLM really started in 2016. This is when Patrisse Cullors became the leader of the Global National Network, or whatever, they were calling themselves the Global, Black Lives Matter Global Network at this point. And she had made Black Lives Matter Global Network a foundation at this time. And they would go on to engage in unethical financial practices until the situation came to a head in 2020 when we had George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery who were killed by the police. And suddenly everybody remembers that BLM existed and starts throwing millions of dollars at BLM, Global National Network. And you know, the funding and mismanagement came to light later on that year when Patrisse Cullors attempted to purchase a $6 million mansion with the funds that were generated from BLM Global Network. Cullors was also on the board of BLM Global National as well as his director, which was a conflict of interest. And upon these discoveries, BLM chapters put forward a statement demanding accountability. And in 2022, BLM Grassroots, which was an offset of BLM that was formed so that BLM could separate the chapters from the foundation money that they were getting. BLM Grassroots had sued BLM Global National Network for financial mismanagement, and that lawsuit ended up being dismissed in 2023. So today, BLM has sort of receded into the background, right? Folks are not really talking about it. Folks aren't really chanting BLM. And, you know, Cullors ended up resigning from Global Network in 2021. Amid the controversy, Alicia Garza and Opus Media no longer involved in the organization. I learned in the last session that they are actually in Europe, doing whatever the fuck. And Shalomaya Bryers, who became the leader after Cullors' departure, ended up funneling millions of dollars into her own consulting agency, and that money came from the BLM Foundation. She's no longer a part of the organization, but like that's just like a pattern of the kind of bullshit that was happening. BLM Global Network has since been undergoing a rebranding, trying to present itself as an organization that cares about transparency, but we all know that it's bullshit. We don't even know who is running BLM Global National right now. So, so much for transparency. Will BLM return as an organization? Or will it return to the forefront? When the next high-profile police shooting happens, we all know that it is going to happen. We all know that it's coming, right? We all know that there is going to be a point where a deadly encounter with police reaches a new level of high-profile status, and BLM might jump into the forefront. BLM's reputation has been severely damaged by the practices of colors, obviously, and just the general reception to that, which has also soured its relationships with its donors. I don't think that BLM is strong enough to head the fore if that happens, but an organization like BLM could still do the same shit that BLM did under a different name, right? And so it's important for us to protect and safeguard our movements from that happening. I don't know how much time do I have?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. I wanted to talk really quickly about some ways to spot grifters. One thing that I've noticed, so if you see a person in movement who is constantly collecting data and metrics and tracking information, trying to get how much stuff was distributed during a distro, or how many people attended a protest or a rally, right? It's possible that they could be using that information to write a grant because grant writers need those kinds of metrics in order to substantiate their funding. If you see a person that is always in front of a camera but never does shit behind the scenes, they're always trying to get in front of the camera, they're always trying to speak for movement in front of press, that's somebody to keep a lookout for. Hijacking and rerouting movement goals is when a person who is trying to change or alter the trajectory of a movement or trying to change and alter the demands and intentions of that movement. And a lot of people do this through packing in or stacking the deck, which means bringing in a whole bunch of people who agree with them into movement in order to sort of swarm the field and overwhelm the actual legitimate organizers who are doing that work. This is you can see this when folks from BLM showed up in Ferguson in caravans to take place in Ferguson Uprising, which essentially displaced actual Ferguson organizers who had been organizing a campaign since before the non-indictment, right? Those are some, another thing I wanted to talk about, the peace police. If somebody is overtly and aggressively pro-peace and is trying to tell other people how they should show up in movement and trying to repress militancy in movement, that is a huge red flag. And the reason why it's a huge red flag is because a lot of times these grifters depend on building up their reputations and their public image. And they view being connected to violence or to militancy as damaging to the kind of public image that they're trying to create. So a lot of times the folks who are the most pro-peace, the most vocal about being peaceful, are the folks who have a vested interest in forming public image that is pristine and is not connected to violence. And that's all I would say. Thank you again.
So the question for our next speaker, Lauren, how have you seen grifters manifest Chicago. How does this hurt movement you, and what are the ways in which we try to overcome these hurdles?
Hi everyone.
Yo.
Hey. So I'm here in Chicago, and I see a relationship between politicians and the nonprofits. They work together to benefit their self-serving interests and grift off of this movement to end police brutality. We have two major culprits. One is the mayor of Chicago. He ran on the ticket of being progressive. He had all these campaign promises that was going to be for the people, right? And people had this hope again, and so that's how he was voted in, along with these promises to end police brutality. He oversees city policy, including CPD. He directly appoints the superintendent, Larry Snelling, of the Chicago Police, who oversees the entire CPD personnel. And the mayor also oversees the budget, which includes police misconduct settlement budget and prosecuting protesters who are protesting police brutality. The other one we have is one of the biggest nonprofits, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. It's a mouthful, CAARPR. I'll refer to them as CARPR for the rest of this time. And they're part of, or this is the Chicago chapter of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. They've been around for decades, and they're a group claiming to fight to end police brutality. So Brandon Johnson's proposal for ending police brutality is pushing mental health reforms, which includes reopening shuttered mental health clinics, having a rapid response team of mental health professionals so that when someone calls 911 reporting a mental health crisis, as opposed to calling the police, these professionals are supposed to show up. But none of this is true because we know that on January 3rd of 2025, Timothy Glaze, who was enduring a mental health crisis, and his partner Charlotta called 911 to get that help. Instead of getting that help, he got 16 bullets by CPD. And mental health services, they are great and they are necessary for people, but Brandon Johnson is fooling people into believing that this is somehow going to stop killer cops that are still on the streets, because his killers are still out there today. And then for CARPR, their solution to ending police brutality is what they call the community control of the police. And I'm pulling straight from their website what this means to them. It means the passive legislation to have an elected Civilian Police Accountability Council, CPAC, to hold police officers accountable for crimes such as assault, murder, torture, and racial profiling. That sounds great in theory, right? I want to live in a world where the police are held accountable. The problem with pushing this is that this has already existed in a million renditions of alphabet soup reforms. Right now in Chicago, it's COPA, or I can never even remember it, the other one. It's such a mouthful. It's the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability, CCPSA. So these have existed time and time again. Dare to Struggle in Chicago, we wrote a pamphlet about it called Lipstick on the Pig, the myth of police review boards. Because all of these haven't done anything to materially change the fact that killer cops are still out on the streets. But they'll still push these reforms. And it's misleading because it's suggesting that the system that is designed to oppress, brutalize, and murder Black and other oppressed people will somehow make exceptions to its own rules. And it's failing to acknowledge that law enforcement, as it exists in the system, is the militant force to uphold the blueprint of the system to oppress, brutalize, and murder Black and oppressed people. And it fails to acknowledge that the only way for the system's blueprint to cease to be is to decisively fight for this blueprint to be destroyed, not gradually reformed. And if these reforms worked, mental health, community control of police, if these reforms actually worked, there would be data to show for it. But what do these grifters have to show for it instead? In the United States, we know the police kill more people each year than the year before. And some stats from Chicago, in 2025, CPD shot 12 people, killing 6, which matched the total number of people shot and killed in all of 2024. And if you recall back to 2 discussions before where Araceli mentioned the CPD budget from 2025, it's a deja vu this year, and worse, because it was just reported last week. They budgeted $80 million for police misconduct settlements, and they've already doubled that as of last week. We aren't even 4 months into this year. So the grifters have nothing to show for these reforms they're pushing. They're proven to be dead-end strategies, so what are they benefiting from pushing these? For Carper, they get the funding. They get to continue pushing these legislative reforms and prop up these politicians who will then, in turn, support their legislative reforms. Carper gives Brandon Johnson here the publicity so he can garner public support and get the votes same way he did last time. And Brandon Johnson gets to boost Carper as a viable option to ending police brutality. Like, Carper's gonna do it so he doesn't have to take responsibility as mayor of Chicago and hold his killer cops accountable. And Carper, they get to have this social clout and a moral validation. People can join Carper as a way to make themselves look like a good person, completely avoiding doing the humbling work of going to people directly impacted by police brutality and waging a struggle with them. And part of that struggle includes correctly identifying who the enemy is.
Speak on it.
And so this is manifested in my lived experience in so many ways. I only have some time to share 2 examples. One was last year in March. Brandon Johnson was doing this listening session with Carper to boast about his follow through on campaign promises. And one of those promises was his mental health reforms. And so we took that as an opportunity to go with Charlotta, the partner of Timothy Glaze, to directly confront him and demand that he answer to the murder of Timothy because he hadn't said anything about it for months. And as we were trying to demand answers out of him, we were physically removed by his security with the cops waiting outside. And Carper, who was there, what did they do? They sat there and said nothing. And the chairman, Frank Chapman, even still said he insisted people unite around the mayor, just completely turning away from the reality of Charlotta there demanding answers. And this happens again and again. In November of last year, we went to another event where Brandon Johnson was slated to speak at the conference that Carper was holding here to, again, answer to the murder of Timothy, and now at this point, the murder of 19-year-old Nate Farron, who was killed last May. And Carper took more of an active role in trying to silence Charlotta and supporters demanding this, something Dubian mentioned of the peace police. They're choreographed. Carper started to link arms and physically protect the mayor. Physically protect him from what? From who? From Charlotta and the supporters. They started to drown her out with the chant, "Let the mayor speak." Once again, physically removed, and this time with Carper's active assistance. And so we see in these stories that this isn't coincidental. There's a pattern of these groups misdirecting people and deliberately silencing these families, deliberately propping up this quote-unquote progressive mayor as a solution so that it can preserve their self-serving interests for the funding, for the social clout and validation, for these legislative reforms that have proven to not work. And so where does this leave people in the struggle? It leaves them just straight up lied to about what it will actually take to end police brutality. And for those, or it leaves people to think that maybe the system's just broken and we can tweak it here and there, and that will somehow solve the problem here. Or for those who have lost faith in the system entirely, it leaves them with no hope to think that there's any alternative because the alternatives provided have been Brandon Johnson and Carper. So it leaves them disillusioned into thinking that there's no alternative possible. Yet, something Rich mentioned, both Brandon Johnson and Carper, they use this radical language, revolutionary terms, they'll call on the Black Panthers, and this is all a tactic to confuse people. Because it's in their interest to keep the system remaining as is, it's also in their interest to use this terminology to confuse people and to defer masses of people from being resistant on their own terms. Brandon Johnson at this conference, he said, I'm going to quote, he said, "If we are going to defeat this system, I need you to stand with me, not against me, to take on the corporate interests and white supremacy." So he's using these, hot button words: defeat the system, white supremacy. And anyone with a reasoning and heart wants these things to happen, but we have to observe actions versus words, because he will say anything except demand that killer cops be jailed, because he's still in the interest of serving CPD. And so what gets more confusing is Carper does have this militant edge. They're not afraid of doing direct confrontation with people in power. But we have to ask, towards what goal are they doing these militant confrontations? In my experience, when I go to families impacted and I ask them, what's the goal, what do you want? It's usually jail killer cops. And Carper's goals that they put forth, well, they will put that on the list of prosecute these cops. It's always followed by a footnote of reforms, constantly moving the goalpost away from what the families are demanding and centralizing any strategy towards getting there. And so, how do we stop this hijacking from happening? We have to see, we have to look at where have we seen the most effective change happen in Chicago and where did it go wrong? When Laquan McDonald was murdered, the mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, he held that dash cam footage for over a year because he knew it would piss people off and get them in the streets. And when it was released, it did just that. People would not shut up. They demanded that Jason Van Dyke be convicted, and they lit a fire under the mayor's ass. And what did the mayor do to pacify this rage? He created a task force to investigate CPD, and the task force came back with the results that CPD disproportionately brutalized Black people. So great, you took this righteous rage people had and then told them what they already know from their lived experiences. And then we saw it again in 2020. Chicago responded to the national call for justice for George Floyd. And what happened again? Carper had an active role here with local politicians in pushing one of the alphabet soup reforms. So we're seeing this time and time again. That's why these grifters need to be publicly exposed for their grift. We need to publicly expose Brandon Johnson the same way that people in Chicago did Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel was easy to hate. Brandon Johnson, sneakier because he was going off a progressive ticket, but again, we have to look at the material actions and results that are coming as opposed to the words. So we need to expose him for what he is, and we need to publicly expose Carper and other nonprofits who also destroy this mass resistance with their own agendas. And there needs to be direct confrontations. From some of the story times I told you, these things need to happen in real life. And we need to continue exposing that. So one, we can expose the contradiction between these grifters' words and then the realities of impacted families. And then hopefully this kind of direct confrontation will demonstrate to people who are otherwise completely discouraged that there's any alternative, that there is an alternative worth fighting for. And it can't involve these grifters.
Continue to be badass. Appreciate it. Okay, and then we have a last question for Joy. What are the ways in which the movement was dragged away from the struggle towards reformist schemes? I'm sorry. What are the ways in which the movement was dragged away from militant struggle towards reformist schemes?
Right, I'm really happy to be here, and this is the first time I've been in this building. And about earlier this morning, I was schooled about, do you understand who Jeff Ford was, and do you understand, how important Fred Hampton was, and how the relationship exists. So that history, those ancestors, right, or Jeff Ford is still alive and needs to be brought home. But I want to start historically with Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. Because even though we're talking about very important things and we're registering how deadly and violent the police are, I think the narrative that we're working through is the same narrative from half a century ago, right? So December 4th, there's an assassination, shaped by the FBI and the Chicago Police Department, right? And it takes two people out, Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. A week later, which I guess is December 11th, is they try to do the same thing in Southern California. But people were organized because in some ways, Geronimo Pratt had served time in Vietnam. My dad was in Vietnam too. I mean, a war is a war. And I would say the police were at war as well. But if you think of the way in which the military can structure and also resist certain kind of predatory power, liberatory power, right? That can resist the predator. These are all important things that I try to keep in mind. So when I say that the important issues that you're talking about now, I see them as tied to two things, right? That the grifter, and I said this earlier, the grifter is a system of economics. It's not so much individual people. We all pretty much agree that. Because you could shame or expose one and another one pops right up, right? So the question becomes, how do you change the economics, right? How do you destroy an economic system that is based on that type of consumption and performance? And the second is a straight up, which goes back to Fred and to, Geronimo, who had to do 27 years falsely accused. It's how do we do this in a war zone? Right, so what I'm trying to say is when you talk about the Chicago Alliance for Racist and Political Repression, I link this back to the early 1970s as well, late 1960s, early 1970s. Oh, wow. That's so pretty, dude. Let's finish this up. It's, for me, I'm trying not to be too abstract, right? We talk about the Epstein class. What if it's an Epstein, it's cool. What if it's not so much Epstein class, here's the roster of like these heinous people. What if it's an Epstein economy? And it's woven into the economy, it's woven into maybe the Mossad, maybe it's woven into the CIA. This is what you're facing with the nonprofit garbage, which you've already articulated. It's so deeply woven in these different sectors of social society and the economy of the government as well. How would you break an economy? We already know who betrayed you. The question is, how do you disassemble their very structure that allows them to make money? Does that make sense? And so when I think of that, I link it to the issue of war resistance. So my questions, again, may sound a bit abstract, but for me it's really important. All the work that you guys have been doing for years is imperative. But every time you expose somebody, another joker jumps up again. So if you can dismantle their structure, let them jump and then fall, because there's nothing stable for them to stand on. So I have more questions than I have answers. But I think when we talk about co-optation, I'm gonna wrap it up. It's half a century that you're struggling against. We said earlier that what you have in Chicago around the Alliance grew out of Angela Davis's defense committee. So she was acquitted in June 1972. Rochelle McGee did another 50 years. He was also acquitted, but the judge never entered the jury verdict to get him out. So he only got out in 2023, right? And I'm wondering, is it helpful to study the past in order to better understand the trajectory in the current moment? So the Chicago Alliance comes from, after Angela is acquitted, it's built up from the National Alliance of Racist and Political Repression. In some ways, it's in tension against certain kind of radicals because they don't have that kind of money. And Toni Morrison is on the board, Angela's mother is on the board. So you get respectability, and that brings the money. But you don't get the productivity to take down the engine that's running over you. And so, what is our capacity to break a 50-year trend and not sort of get distracted by the people who are coming to you? Because they could be nameless. You can get, we can name all the black women, the sisters, and I did mention that some of them are in the UK now, because they don't get that much hate. But they're still doing the same thing in London that they were doing, in California. So it's a global brand, and they always said it was going to be a global brand. So capture is always global. So I mean, my question, we're not going to, no, maybe we could burn it down, but we probably can't burn it down. So then the question becomes, how do you dismantle structure? And I'm not saying you're distracted by individuals, but because of our emotional intelligence and we care about families that are being decimated by the police, I think sometimes our rage against the official killers distracts us from a long plan to make sure that repetition of violent death isn't our inheritance. right? And so at some time you have to stand back and like the predator has like a $500 suit on, you know, several years ago would be hanging out with Obama's crew. Like so much is co-opted that we have to, like, what you're already doing with the creativity of just bringing it down, but also bringing it down in a way to the extent that we can, that we have longevity in the struggle. I would say to wrap, all of your icons betrayed you. And it seems you're pretty sophisticated, you already knew that. But I can say as an academic, when I teach, it's really hard to kind of deprogram students who were trained in abolitionists that also got funded around the 70s. And just the money flooded and everybody wants to be ethical and everybody wants to be safe and blah. So academia definitely is your antagonist. And that would include me as well. And so the question is, how do you break systems without being distracted by personalities?
Thank you to our speakers. So we had 4 questions that were behind the outlining of notes that I passed out earlier. The intention was to kind of split the room 2 ways, or 1 way, and go over each of these questions, and then we'll take some time to reflect on them, and then we'll come back and kind of speak out loud about what we think about them. So, do we know what time?
Yeah, we got actually a good amount of time. We have until 5:25.
Oh, really?
It's actually about like 30 minutes. So we got plenty of time. I think it would be productive if we split it like half and half. So maybe